Well, hello. At one point in a conversation I was having with an atheist family member, I got him to admit that if Jesus really rose from the dead, then we would have to follow him. Now, my family member's fallback was that resurrections do not happen. So Jesus could not have risen from the dead, obviously. Okay, besides the fact of his anti-supernatural bias, there are very significant things written about Jesus' resurrection in the New Testament. It makes it clear that since Jesus is risen from the dead, every one of us answers to God for our response to Jesus. And if we do not believe that God raised him from the dead, we will not be saved. Consequently, this matter of Jesus' resurrection is a key factor for all of us, including my atheist family member. Well, Easter Day has come and gone weeks ago. But you know what? We're still in Easter season. And one of the keys of Jesus' resurrection is his appearances, plural, to people after his death. There was a period of post-resurrection appearances for, we are told, 40 days after Christ's crucifixion. The book of Acts puts it this way, that Jesus showed himself alive after his passion by many infallible proofs, being seen of them 40 days. Now, these appearances of Jesus became an important part of the gospel message. The Apostle Paul puts it like this in 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. For I delivered unto you first of all that which I also received, how that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, and that he was buried, and that he rose again the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he was seen of Cephas, that's Peter, then of the 12, and after that he was seen of above 500 brethren at once. After that he was seen of James, then all of the apostles, and last of all he was seen of me also, as of one born out of due time. So Paul is making a very important point here. He talks about the gospel being Jesus' death and burial and resurrection. But notice that 4 times in this passage, after he mentions those things about Jesus, he mentions that Jesus was seen. He was seen 4 times. So this makes the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus seem not only as much a part of, but you could even argue more central to the gospel. In another address, Paul uses that same verb to describe that Jesus was seen many days by many people after his resurrection. That sermon is in Acts chapter 13. And that same exact verb is used to say Jesus was seen by his apostles for 40 days in that period of time that we read about earlier in the book of Acts. One of the most common objections to this straightforward account of these proofs and appearances is that the disciples had hallucinations, thinking that they saw Jesus, who was actually not there. Now, what the anti-supernaturalist might say is something like this. Since we know hallucinations happen, after all, about 15% of the human population has experienced some kind of a hallucination. We know hallucinations happen and resurrections do not, so the most likely explanation for the disciples' experiences after Jesus' death was that they hallucinated seeing him. Another thing they might add is they were grief-stricken at their master's death, and grief often induces hallucinations. I know, for example, after my grandmother died, I had an auditory hallucination. I heard her singing in her sweet voice after I got back from Tennessee, back to Virginia, walked into my apartment, and I heard my grandmother. She wasn't there. That wasn't a reality. If you were there, you probably would not have heard her, but I did. And that's an auditory hallucination. What exactly is a hallucination? Well, I kind of hinted at it when I just talked about my experience with my grandmother. But according to one online medical dictionary, hallucinations involve sensing things such as visions, sounds, or smells that seem real, but are not. These things are created by the mind, it continues. And we would add, they occur only in the mind, not in external reality. Now we also we would admit that grief can and does lead to hallucinations, like, for example, mine. But if we accept hallucination as the explanation for what the disciples claimed to have experienced, namely seeing, hearing, eating with, and even touching Jesus after he died, we run into some really serious problems. First, it is no small matter that these accounts do not only report of individual appearances of Jesus, but of groups of people seeing Jesus at the same time doing the same thing. That's really important. If Jesus appeared, as these passages say, to groups of people, we can hardly say that the disciples hallucinated. The idea of a group hallucination is inconsistent with current psychiatric and psychological data. Dr. Gary Collins, a licensed clinical psychologist, stated, hallucinations are individual occurrences. By their very nature, only one person can see a given hallucination at a time. They certainly are not something which can be seen by a group of people. And another clinical psychologist, Dr. Gary Sibsey, after 2 decades of research, did not find, as he says, a single documented case of a group hallucination. Now, if the disciples hallucinated Jesus, they would have had individual perceptions and certainly would not have seen Jesus doing the same thing. Yet, there's one account in which Jesus appears to the group of the disciples, the whole group, and he asked for something to eat, and he invited them all to handle him. You'll find that in Luke chapter 24. And then they remembered as a group that Jesus appeared to them and showed them his hands and his feet, which would be evidence of his crucifixion. If the disciples hallucinated Jesus, that would mean he was still dead and buried, that you could go to Jerusalem into that tomb and find his corpse. They and anyone not believing their message or wanting to shut them up would simply have to go to the tomb and produce that corpse. That would have put an end to their delusions and the Christian movement immediately. But curiously, that did not happen. Now, some might say that Paul and James, who Paul mentions, himself and James both having individual appearances of Jesus come to them, they saw Jesus after his death. Some might say, well, they certainly experienced individual hallucinations. But in both cases, there would still be the corpse lying in a tomb as evidence that he did not rise from the dead, and they were just hallucinating. Further, it is highly unlikely that either of these two men, because they were skeptics, and we did an earlier video on James and his relationship to the whole question of the resurrection. But these two skeptics would not have allowed themselves to be deluded into confessing Jesus as the Lord by a mere hallucination, a confession that eventually would lead to their executions. They would have wanted to be sure that Jesus was alive before hazarding their lives for his cause, let alone saying that he had risen from the dead. So when you really start analyzing this hallucination theory, it simply holds no water. So what is the explanation for these post-resurrection appearances? All the evidence seems to be pointing to the reality that Jesus has indeed risen from the dead. Now, one more thing we should point out is that hallucinations are usually quick. They last seconds, maybe minutes. But Jesus took a 40-day period after his resurrection to show himself alive on repeated occasions. The disciples also did not quickly believe that he was raised, and it admittedly took them a while to catch on that he was really alive. But once they got it, it changed their lives and the course of history. They could not shut up about it. Even when their well-being and their very lives were at stake, such threats did not deter them from proclaiming that Christ is risen. This proclamation has led at that time rapidly to an expanding church that eventually overturned the Roman Empire, and it has since then changed the world forever. So in conclusion, let me restate what my atheist family member said. If Christ is risen from the dead, then we should be his followers. There seems to be ample proof that he has risen. So what is holding you back from fully following him? If you like our videos, subscribe. And also you can push that bell and get notifications when we post new material. But please like and share this video. And we hope to see you soon again. Until then, God bless you and keep you.